Good morning and welcome to our Thursday morning devotions. Thanks to Karen for the beautiful prelude this morning. Are there any introductions or announcements? Thanks for taking a few moments out this morning for devotions. Thanks to those of you who are live streaming this morning. I'm grateful that you're part of our devotions as well. I'm Greg Wilcox with Mission Integration. I'm going to talk a little bit about forgiveness this morning. That's the theme. There are two texts that I'd like to use. I'm going to rehearse the one and read the other. And the one I'll rehearse is a parable that Jesus tells in Matthew 18, verses 21 and following. So if you want to read it sometime, you can. Peter asked Jesus, "How often do I have to forgive someone? 7 times?" No, Jesus says 7 times 7, which is basically there's no limit. And then Jesus tells a wonderful little story that is a foundational parable for me. A king is settling his accounts, and there is one of his servants who owes $1 million. And if you don't pay up, typically at that time, first century Palestine, then you can be thrown in jail. And the servant begs the king to have mercy. And so the king forgives him that entire debt, that $1 million. And the servant, then you can imagine, jumping for joy, leaves the king's presence. And as he does, he meets a fellow servant who owes him $100. And he says to his fellow servant, "You have to pay up. I want my $100. And the fellow servant says, "I don't have it. Please be patient with me." And this servant refuses. He demands his money and says, "I'm going to throw you in jail until you pay the entire debt." As you can imagine, the king is not happy. Here's verse 32. Then his lord summoned him and said to him, "You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you?" Whenever I'm asked to officiate at a wedding, which happens from time to time, I always try to slip this text into my little message, whether or not the bride and groom approve of it, and it's always the bride who's making the decisions. I always slip this one in. This, for me, is critical. So this is the other foundational text, Colossians 3, 12 through 17. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other. Just as the Lord has forgiven you, you also must forgive. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony, and on he goes. And oftentimes people think that at a wedding you would emphasize love, and that's pretty important. That, for me, is never most important. When you think about living with another person for the rest of your lives, forgiveness is more important than love. Forgiveness is more important than love. As the Lord forgave you, so also you must forgive. I was driving home the other day, and the traffic was heavy. I was driving on Cliff towards home, and all of a sudden the car in front of me slammed on its brakes, so I was following pretty closely, I had to slam on my brakes, and the car following behind me had to slam on its brakes. I heard the screeching, and I looked in my rearview mirror, and the woman in the car was yelling and screaming and making rather rude gestures in my direction. I wanted to say to her, "You dunderhead, it wasn't my fault. You know, do you think I just stopped to piss you off?" No. And I thought, well, probably if I get out of the car and go lecture her, that's not going to help. And as I drove away, I was steamed with the unfairness of it, that I would be berated and yelled at and flipped off for something that was not my fault. And I realized I had a choice. I had a choice between two things, and that's all I had a choice of in that situation. I could stew over the unfairness of it. I could think to myself, what a dumb woman. that she didn't recognize we were both in traffic. What's wrong with her? I could go on and on about the unfairness of it, or I could forgive her. I could forgive her. I was in a meeting some time ago, and I made what I thought was a very intelligent, insightful comment and suggestion, and it was ignored. Totally ignored. And the meeting just went on and on without any discussion of my suggestion. And I felt hurt that I was ignored that way, and realized with this little situation after the meeting was over, I had a choice. I could stew over it. I could think how unfair it was. I could be mad at the person or the people who simply ignored me, or I could forgive them. I could simply forgive them and let it go. I'm part of a nonprofit board of a nonprofit organization, and I have been for some time. And there was a new board chair who came not so long ago, and I suddenly found myself demoted. There are no positions on the board, and by demoted I mean I simply was relegated to not being very important anymore. I was asked to give up the little subcommittee chair, and I wasn't called on, and it just felt like something significant had happened. I didn't know why, but it was a shift. And I recognized that I could stew about it, I could be mad about it, I could dwell on it and think how unfair it was, or I could simply forgive the new board chair. Most of all, for me, the person that makes me the unhappiest is myself. When I do a devotion or have a workshop or a retreat or preach a sermon and it is uninspired, it just falls flat, and I realize that I haven't thought hard enough about it. I haven't worked on it enough. I messed up. I tend to really berate myself and spend days, weeks, wondering what I did wrong and just angry with how poorly I had done in that particular situation. And I realize I have a choice with myself, as I do with the woman in the car or the person in the meeting or the new board chair. I have a choice. I can continue to stew over what I did wrong, the way I messed up, or I can forgive myself. I can forgive myself. Forgiveness, in the final analysis, is essential to my and your sense of well-being, of wholeness. It's essential for our emotional and our spiritual being okay in the lives that we lead. Whether or not the woman in the car or the person in the meeting or the board chair or myself ever recognize that they're the wrong ones and come and say, I'm sorry, that almost is beside the point, because most often that will not happen. The person who has wronged you will not come and say, you know, I really messed up. Would you forgive me? It doesn't happen, except for occasionally. But the little parable Jesus tells and the directive from Paul, put on then as God's chosen ones, make no reference to anybody ever saying, I'm sorry. It has to do with recognizing we have been forgiven time and time and time and time and time and time and time again. God forgives us endlessly because of his love for us in Jesus. And because of that, we are told we must turn and forgive the ones who hurt and wrong us. We must forgive. As the Lord forgave you, you also must forgive is a wonderful recipe for feeling a deep sense of peace of mind. Wow, look what God has done for me, and even a sudden sense of joy. I am forgiven. All that I messed up, I am forgiven. As the Lord forgives you and me, you also must forgive. Amen. Off of our list today, we're praying for Golden Valley, Minnesota, Department of Digestive Health and those they serve, family and friends having challenges in school, private prayer requests. But this little list today also has one of our former Good Sam locations, Goodland, Kansas. It's one of the ones that we have sold. And it reminded me that there are places and people that are no longer part of Good Sam that might feel like they have been wronged by our organization. Some surely just left on their own, and that's great. But some we let go, and some we sold even if they didn't want to be sold. And they may be harboring the kinds of deep unhappiness that come when you feel like you have been wronged. And so that's who I'd like to pray for today, and then we'll sing our little song. Prayers for the other people I've named, but I especially want to pray for places and people who continue to harbor some sense of unhappiness about what has happened to them here in this place in people called Good Sam. Would you pray with me, please? Gracious God, you know all of those places and all of those people through these past months and years who were part of Good Sam and then are no longer, for whatever reasons, whatever happened. You know deep inside the many heads and hearts, the places where their anger and frustration and unhappiness is still nurtured and stewed over. And you know how that casts a dark shadow over those many lives. God, I pray that by the power of your Spirit blowing through their heads and hearts, you would help them see that you have forgiven them all the things, the broken places, the wrong things, the sin in their lives, and you would help them turn and forgive all of those places and people who have wronged them. Free them from the heaviness, the chains of not forgiving another. Thanks, Jesus, that we are forgiven each and every day because of your love, your mercy, your grace, your sacrifice for us on the cross. We pray all these things in your precious name. Amen. Joyful, joyful, we adore thee. 836. We'll sing all three verses. Thanks to Karen for playing today. Thanks again for coming, folks. Have a great Thursday.